A warm welcome to today's video explaining moral realism for philosophy A-level. Now, this video will break down the two different theories, the two different versions of moral realism, and also the four criticisms that you'll need to understand. Now, this video won't address Hume's is-ought gap. That's such an important idea that it already has its own video on my channel. Now, we need to first understand the terms of moral realism and of cognitivism, because if you don't, these theories are going to be rather difficult to understand. Now, always mirror back to the exam board what they define a theory to be. In this case, moral realism is the position that there are mind-independent moral facts or properties. Moral naturalism is the first theory that we need to understand for this. And that's the position that moral properties, the things which are good, are natural properties. And by natural, what we mean is things which we could discover using science, with empiricism. So they need to be physical things in the world which we can measure. And that means that morality is reduced to a physical thing. Now, there are two different types of moral naturalism that we need to understand. The first one is utilitarianism, specifically Bentham's form of hedonistic utilitarianism. And he argues that happiness, by way of maximising pleasure and minimising pain, that is the source of goodness. And this means that the psychological state is the natural state which agents should strive for. And so happiness, that's the natural state, that's what we need to maximise. Virtue ethics, though there is some debate on this in the literature, the exam board would like you to understand virtue ethics, you can see here, virtue ethics as a naturalist theory. And so, as I said, although there is some debate, just for the sake of the exams, understand virtue ethics as a naturalist theory. Now, the way we can read virtue ethics as so is by examining things like the function argument, which argue that reason is the end of humanity. So what separates humans from all other animals is the faculty of reason. And so living as a rational agent is moral. And so the natural property here is reason. And this is because rationality is a fact of our nature. So goodness in this case is reason, and living in accordance with reason, flourishing because of your ability to reason, that's moral in this case. The next theory that we need to understand is moral non-naturalism. And in non-naturalism, moral properties, moral judgments are intuitive and they are self-evident. In the same way that when I say all triangles have three sides, that statement is true in and of itself. That's a self-evident statement. In the same way, when I say it is wrong to torture people, in that statement, I'm saying exactly what I mean. That's my intuition. And so moral language denote unique, non-natural properties. And this means that ethical language is a type of mental state. It's an intuition. These properties can be true or false. So it can be true that it is wrong to torture people for fun, or it can be false. I would argue that it's true. And the purpose of moral language is still to express beliefs about the world. I think that it is wrong in the world to torture people for fun, and these can be true or false. Now, the version of this that you are expected to know by the exam board is G.E. Moore, this guy here, his theory, intuitionism. Now, he argues that good is indefinable. And this is because when we consider any attempt to define good, we can ask, but is X really good? Is happiness really good? Is reason really good? Is following duties really good? And the mere fact that we can provide counterexamples shows that any definition is inadequate. when I say, or when I ask the question, are all bachelors really unmarried men? That's an absurd question. Because if you understand what all of those words mean, the question answers the question. Like the words in the question answer the question itself. But that isn't true when I ask, is happiness good? Is reason good, for example? That isn't true. And so these are open questions. This is the open question argument. And so good is not happiness necessarily, or it's not reason necessarily. And this means that any attempt to define good fails. And what Moore argues is good, and that is that. And that's all that he has to say on the matter. And so, when I make a moral claim, like murder is wrong, for example, that's my intuition. Okay? My intuition is such that I believe moral is wrong. Now, this is still a statement that can be true or false, because there is still intrinsic of any act, it is still true that murder is wrong or is right. And so when we say something is good, it is our intuitive recognition of the intrinsic properties of an act or of an object. And finally, we'll address the criticisms that you need to understand for this theory, beginning with Hume's fork. Now, we can also combine this with Ayres' verification principle. So both these ideas show that moral statements are not meaningful. I am taking it for granted that you understand what Hume's fork and Ayres' verification principle are. Hume's fork obviously is the position or is the framework by which we can prove propositions. So there are two types of knowledge propositions. They're either analytically true by definition, tautologies, or they are empirically true in the world. And what Ayres does is he progresses this to say that statements are only meaningful if they adhere to Hume's fork. Now, this can be used as a criticism of moral realism, because realism is the position that there are mind-independent moral facts. And so, if there are moral facts, then some moral facts are true and others are false. So some claims are accurate to the independent moral standard and some aren't. And so the moral realist says that at least some claims are true and some claims about morality are false. But what Hume and Ayres are doing is they say, well, hold on. Like, how are those statements true? How are those statements false? Because they're not true by definition. When I say murder is wrong, the opposite, murder is right, is not a contradiction. And so they're not tautologies. But when we investigate the real world, we do see all the physical outcomes of an act like murder, but we don't discover some wrongness somewhere. If I give you the timeline of a murder, we don't at some point discover the wrongness or the rightness. We just discover all the physical events. And so these moral facts that supposedly exist can't be discovered, and they can't be proven to be true or false, and so they're meaningless. And this means that we can use Hume's fork to criticise moral realism. This, in my opinion, is a very strong criticism. We can say, and we would like to think, that there's some objective standard of true morality, but how are they true? Because they can't be true analytically, and they can't be true synthetically either. Now, the next criticism from Hume works also very strongly, and that's because you can actually even assume that naturalism is correct. And even if you suppose that naturalism is right, or non-naturalism is right, that still isn't enough for a complete moral framework. Hume's argument, if you see from the example here, is that moral judgments are not beliefs, since beliefs alone could not motivate us. So moral judgments motivate us to act, but beliefs alone don't motivate us to act. Hume argues that reason is the slave of the passions. Knowing the facts of the matter, believing these facts, is not enough to motivate us to act. Now, to make this even stronger in your own mind, to help your understanding, your recall, and your learning, what you can do is you can think of an example that's relevant to your own life. So I'll give you an example of littering. Knowing all the physical facts about littering, that it's harmful for the environment, knowing how many tonnes that the UK pump into our rivers each year, for example, that doesn't motivate us to act alone. What we also need is the desire, in this case, not to cause damage to our environment. But you can do the same example for your friend who might smoke, or for your friend who you think drives too much and is putting too much carbon into the atmosphere, or whatever it is. Maybe you're a vegan or a vegetarian and you want to convert some of your meat-eating peers. All this to say then that you will know just giving them the facts is not enough to change their mind. It's not enough to make them stop eating meat, stop driving their car, or put their litter in the bin. What they also need is the desire to actually do the thing. Moral judgments do motivate us to act. And that means that they can't be beliefs alone. And so simply knowing the natural properties, simply knowing, this is where we can still suppose that utilitarianism is true. Just knowing that happiness is good, that isn't enough. We need to also want general happiness. We also must want the good. So simply knowing the natural properties that supposedly make up morality, that is not enough to actually make us act in a moral way. Now the final two criticisms we will look at are from Mackie. Now these both lead to Mackie's error theory. Now his argument from relativity is that moral judgments are irresolvable. So people's views on abortion, on Gaza, on Ukraine, on any issue, unfortunately, if you actually engage in these, you realise they're not listening. They're not engaging in rational debate. In the same way that our favourite taste might differ. My favourite flavour of ice cream differs maybe from yours. And no matter what I tell you, I can't change your mind. Now this is very different from science, where we can appeal to an actual standard and we can run experiments to change people's positions. All this to say then, ethical disagreement is more like our personal preference, our taste, than like a science. And so morality seems more anti-realist than it does realist. And finally, Mackie's argument from queerness. Of course, Mackie does not mean queerness in terms of gayness. He means queerness in terms of weirdness. Moral values are unlike anything else in the world. Certainly they are unlike any other natural property that we can test and know empirically. This is because moral judgments, moral statements are ought prescriptions and not is descriptions about the world. The statement that the gravity on Earth is 9.81 or something like that, that's a very different statement from the statement that murder is wrong. What that means is there is no way a priori or a posteriori to discover these value judgments in the world. They're completely different from any other type of natural fact. And they're different because they are prescriptions, they're ought statements. All this to say then, moral properties, moral values are weird. They're not like anything else. And therefore morality ought not to be understood as being realist. It ought to be understood as being anti-realist. Because realist, if something is realist, like science is realist, because there's this standard and we can test and we can use measurements. But that just is not true. Moral properties are completely different from these scientific things. And so, again, we lean much more into morality being anti-realist as opposed to realist.